There are bad days, and then there are days when you walk out your front door, coffee in hand, and find an envelope that says eviction notice nailed to your own property. For a full minute, I just stared at it, not sure whether to laugh or be furious. The paper was stamped with bold red letters, and right underneath, signed in perfectly loopy handwriting, was the name Karen L. Whitmore, HOA president. That's when I realized this wasn't some joke. Karen had actually tried to evict me from a home I owned outright. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where lawns are manicured, mailboxes are matching, and everyone pretends they love each other during block parties. It's the type of neighborhood that looks peaceful from the outside, but has more gossip and politics than City Hall. I'd bought my house 5 years ago. Cash, clean title, no mortgage, and absolutely no reason to owe anyone a dime. But the moment Karen became the head of the HOA, she decided my house was somehow a problem. It started small. Warnings about my fence color, complaints about my trash bins being visible, notes about the tone of my exterior lights. All tiny, ridiculous details that had nothing to do with property value and everything to do with her craving control. At first, I ignored it. Everyone warned me about her. The way she patrolled the neighborhood like a self-declared sheriff with her clipboard and camera phone. They called her the HOA Karen. It fit too perfectly. Still, when she taped that eviction notice to my door, something in me snapped. I tore it down, went inside, and sat at my desk reading every word carefully. The notice claimed I was in violation of residential occupancy codes and had 30 days to vacate. It also cited non-compliance with HOA residency restrictions, whatever that was supposed to mean. I knew every line of the HOA bylaws, and none of what she'd written was legitimate. She was bluffing, but she'd gone way too far this time, so I did what I always do when someone underestimates me. I documented everything. I scanned the letter, took photos of my door, and wrote down the exact time and date. Then I called the HOA office directly. Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association, said the receptionist, cheerful as a sales clerk. This is Robert Hayes, I said, keeping my tone calm. I'd like to know why there's an eviction notice on my property. There was a pause. I could almost hear the confusion through the line. Eviction notice. Sir, we don't... A second voice cut in, sharper, colder. This is Karen speaking. You're in violation of community standards, Mr. Hayes. I took a slow breath. Karen, this is my property. You can't evict someone who owns their home. You're leasing your guest unit, she snapped. That violates our single-family occupancy code. I frowned. That's not what the law says, and you have no authority to enforce zoning restrictions. I'll see you in court if necessary, she said, then hung up. That's when I realized she wasn't bluffing. She was obsessed. Later that evening, I went through every document I had. Property deed, lease agreements, zoning maps. Everything was airtight. My house was fully compliant, and the small guest house out back was legally permitted as a rental. Karen's case wasn't just weak. It was non-existent. But something about the way she'd spoken, the confidence, the arrogance, made me think she believed she could actually win, and that meant she had a plan. I spent the next few days quietly collecting evidence. Every letter she sent, every voicemail she left, every ridiculous infraction she claimed I'd committed. My office printer was running non-stop as I scanned and filed every piece of it. It wasn't just paranoia. It was preparation. I'd dealt with people like Karen before, the kind who confuse authority with ownership, the kind who believe that rules apply to everyone except them. And sure enough, just a few days later, she made her next move. A knock echoed at my front door one Saturday morning. When I opened it, 2 sheriff's deputies stood on my porch. "Mr. Hayes?" one of them asked. "Yeah," I said cautiously. "We've received a complaint from your HOA regarding unauthorized occupancy and trespassing." I blinked. Trespassing? On my own property? The taller deputy glanced at his clipboard. "They claim you're renting out an unapproved unit." I laughed. Couldn't help it. "Come on in, officers. Let's make this quick." We walked through the house and out to the guest unit. I showed them the zoning certificate and the signed inspection clearance from the city. Everything perfectly legal, perfectly filed. One of the deputies nodded. Looks in order to me. Yeah, the other said. We'll file this as resolved. They left after 10 minutes. Apologetic but professional. But I stood there on the porch, watching their car disappear down the street, and I knew exactly what had just happened. Karen had tried to use the police as her personal muscle, and it had backfired. By that evening, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Word travels fast when a patrol car shows up in a quiet cul-de-sac. I heard the whispers. Did you see the sheriff at Robert's place? Karen's finally going too far. He owns half the rental properties around here. She's messing with the wrong guy. That last one made me smile. Because what Karen didn't know, what no one in the neighborhood knew, was that she wasn't just my HOA president, she was also my tenant. I managed several rental properties through my real estate company. A few months before I moved into Cedar Ridge, one of my management teams had approved a lease for a woman named Karen Whitmore in a nearby unit. When I first saw her name on the HOA roster, I hadn't even connected the dots. But now, after weeks of her harassment, the irony hit me like a lightning bolt. She was renting. From me? The same woman who tried to evict me, the same woman who just called the police on me, lived in one of my properties, and she had no idea. I sat down at my desk, stared at her lease agreement on my computer screen, and couldn't help but grin. If she wanted a war, I was more than ready to give her one, but I wasn't going to fight it with shouting or threats. I was going to fight it with paperwork, precision, and patience, because this time, the HOA president had picked a battle she couldn't possibly win, not against the man who literally owned her roof. After the deputies drove off, I sat on my porch for a long while, coffee cooling in my hand, watching the neighborhood settle back into its picture-perfect calm. It was the kind of quiet that always comes right before another storm. Karen had lost a round, but she wasn't the kind of woman who accepted defeat gracefully. I knew the look in her eyes the last time we spoke, the sharp, trembling fury of someone who believed the world owed her submission. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. I decided it was time to learn exactly who I was dealing with. That evening, I pulled every HOA record I could access. Being a homeowner gave me limited viewing rights, but that was all I needed. The more I read, the more I realized just how long Karen had been running this place like her personal kingdom. Every minor fee increase, every policy change, every community improvement expense, it all carried her signature. She'd pushed through new beautification rules that dictated everything from mailbox color to curtain transparency. The woman had literally written herself power into existence, but her arrogance was her blind spot. She'd left trails, emails, receipts, reimbursements that didn't line up. She'd charged the HOA for consulting with companies that didn't exist. And if my accounting instincts were right, she was siphoning community funds into a private account under a shell name. I sat back and rubbed my jaw, almost impressed. "You've built quite the empire, Karen," I murmured. "Shame it's sitting on sand." The next day, she tried to resume her reign as if nothing had happened. When I came home from work, there was another letter taped to my door, handwritten this time, in bold cursive that looked more desperate than official. Final warning. Remove unauthorized tenant or face legal consequences under HOA Code 9C. I actually laughed out loud. Code 9C didn't even exist. I typed out a short email. "Dear Karen, you have no authority to issue eviction threats. Any further correspondence should be directed through your attorney. Sincerely, Robert Hayes." Then I hit send and got back to real work. But the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was the sound of her regrouping. 3 days later, my tenant from the guest unit, Maya, knocked on my door. She looked uneasy. Robert," she said, "some lady from the HOA came by while you were out. She said she needed to inspect my place for code compliance. I told her she couldn't come in without permission, but she kept taking pictures through the windows." That snapped every last thread of patience I had left. "She didn't have a warrant?" Maya shook her head. "Nope. Just attitude." I thanked her, then went straight inside and called Ben, my attorney and longtime friend. He answered on the second ring. "What's she done now?" "Attempted an illegal inspection," I said, "and harassed my tenant." He sighed the way only a lawyer who's heard everything can sigh. "You've got the paper trail, right?" "Every last email." "Good, keep quiet, keep collecting. When she overplays her hand, and she will, we'll bury her in evidence." I smiled. Music to my ears. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I logged into the rental management system I used for my properties and pulled up Karen's tenant profile. Her rent was current, but just barely, and she'd filed 2 complaints about neighborhood harassment over the past month. Both vague, both marked unresolved. Under the notes section, one of my property managers had written, "Tenant confrontational," suggested legal counsel over HOA disputes. So even outside her role as HOA president, she was still weaponizing her paranoia. I scrolled to her lease file and double-checked every clause. It was solid. No unauthorized property damage. No misuse of HOA authority, and most important, violation of local ordinances constituted grounds for immediate termination. If she kept abusing her position, she wouldn't just lose her title, she'd lose her home. The next HOA meeting confirmed my suspicions. Karen was unraveling. When I walked into the clubhouse that evening, she was already at the front table, jaw tight, papers stacked like armor. The air was thick with tension. "Before we begin," she announced, "we need to discuss ongoing violations that threaten our community's integrity." Her eyes flicked to me. I gave a small nod, inviting her to continue. "This homeowner," she said, voice trembling with forced control, "has ignored repeated notices regarding illegal rental activity." Someone from the crowd asked, "Do you mean Robert?" "He's been here for years." Karen smiled thinly. "I'm not naming names." The murmurs grew. I stood calm and deliberate. "Then allow me," I said. "I'm the homeowner you're referring to, and I have proof that every claim you've made is false." I set a folder on the table in front of her. Inside were copies of the zoning permit, the lease authorization, and the inspection approvals, each one signed and stamped by the city. She didn't even glance at them. "We'll review these later," she said quickly. "No need," I replied. "You can read them now. You've been threatening me with eviction for weeks, and every single one of these documents proves you're wrong." Her cheeks flushed. "You're being combative." "No, Karen," I said softly. "I'm being factual." Someone in the back snorted. Another whispered, "Finally." Karen slammed her gavel, declared the meeting adjourned, and stormed out. I stayed seated, letting the neighbors talk among themselves. The tide had shifted, and everyone in that room could feel it. Later that night, as I was closing up the garage, headlights swept across my driveway. Karen's SUV rolled to a stop at the curb. She sat there for a few seconds, engine idling, staring at my house. Then she lowered the window and shouted, "You think you're untouchable, but you're not." I didn't answer. I just pulled out my phone and started recording. She realized it and peeled off. Tires screeching down the street. That 30-second clip became another piece of evidence, one more thread in the net I was quietly weaving around her. By the end of the week, Ben had everything he needed. We drafted a formal cease and desist notice, citing harassment, attempted trespass, and defamation. The tone was surgical, polite, but lethal in its precision. He sent it by certified mail and copied the HOA board. 2 days later, I got a call from Tracy, one of the board members. "Robert," she said, "what exactly did you send her? She showed up to the office screaming that she was being targeted." "Nothing she didn't earn," I said simply. Tracy sighed. "For what it's worth, half the board's ready to remove her. She's making all of us look bad." "Then do it," I said. "End the circus." "We might just." That night, I poured myself a drink and sat at my desk going over the week's emails. Karen hadn't contacted me once since the letter arrived. No threats, no notices, no late-night drive-bys. For the first time in months, my phone was quiet. But deep down, I knew it wasn't peace. It was strategy. Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She was the type to reload. And when she made her next move, I'd be ready. Because this time, it wouldn't just be my word against hers. It would be the landlord versus the tenant, and I already knew who held the deed. The next week felt like walking through a minefield that only I could see. Karen had gone silent after my attorney's letter, but her quiet wasn't peace. It was plotting. You could feel it in the air. The HOA Facebook group, which usually shared lost pet posts and yard sale flyers, was suddenly filled with long rants about neighborhood integrity and residents who disrespect community rules. She never said my name, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew. Comments trickled in. Some neighbors backed her up, others pushed back. I stayed out of it. There's no winning against a mob fueled by someone with a clipboard and a fragile ego. But the silence at her end told me one thing. She was preparing her next move carefully. On Thursday morning, I found a new letter in my mailbox. This one was printed on HOA letterhead, stamped, and worded like something pulled straight from a courtroom drama. Notice of pending sanction. The Cedar Ridge HOA Board has received multiple complaints regarding your ongoing violation of single-family occupancy zoning. A special meeting will be held to determine fines and enforcement action. It was signed not by Karen this time, but by Tracy, the board's vice president. That surprised me. I called her immediately. "Tracy, why am I getting a sanction notice?" I asked. She sighed. Karen called an emergency session and pushed it through before I could stop it. I had to sign off to keep it on record. "I'm sorry, Robert. She's railroading this process." "How many complaints are we talking about?" 4. But when I checked the database, all of them were submitted from the same IP address. I smiled. "Let me guess. Karen's." "You didn't hear it from me," she said quietly. That night, while the neighborhood watched their TVs and scrolled their phones, I was in my office surrounded by files. Property records, meeting minutes, and most importantly, a thick folder labeled HOA Financials, 2019-2024. I'd requested them under my homeowner rights weeks ago, but the board's accountant finally approved them after Karen's tantrum subsided. I started cross-checking line items with public contractor licenses. Within an hour, I found what I was looking for. 3 invoices from Whitmore Consulting, LLC, each for thousands of dollars. Each marked approved by HOA president, but there was no such company listed in the state business registry. I ran the address and it came back to Karen's personal P.O. box. There it was. Proof that she wasn't just power hungry, she was stealing. By the time the special meeting came around that Saturday, I was ready. The clubhouse was packed. Word had spread that something big was going down. Karen stood at the front, looking smug and self-righteous, her signature clipboard clutched like a judge's gavel. "Thank you all for attending," she began. "We have serious matters to discuss regarding a homeowner's repeated violations. It's time we address the decay of standards that threaten this community." She gestured toward me with a sharp smile. "Mr. Hayes, please stand." I stood slowly. "Before you start your little trial, Karen, I'd like to make sure the board is aware that you've already violated multiple HOA bylaws yourself." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Her smile faltered. "Excuse me?" I opened the folder I'd brought and pulled out printed copies of her fake invoices. "These are payment authorizations to Whitmore Consulting, LLC. It doesn't exist." "The address is your P.O. box," she blinked rapidly. "That's a legitimate vendor." "Funny," I interrupted, "because the state of California doesn't think so." I checked. It's not a registered business. But the funds were real, and they came from HOA accounts. Tracy leaned forward. "Is that true, Karen?" Karen's voice wavered. "Those payments were reimbursements for community maintenance." "Community maintenance?" I said. "You mean your new backyard fence? Because the receipt says lumber delivery." The room fell silent. Even the board members who usually nodded along with her looked uneasy. Karen's jaw tightened. "You're twisting facts. This isn't about me. This is about you breaking HOA policy." I smiled, calm as stone. "Actually, this is about you trying to evict a homeowner illegally, falsifying evidence and misusing HOA funds. But if you'd rather talk about my property, we can do that too." I brought copies of my city permits. "Would you like to see them?" Her face turned red, not from embarrassment, but rage. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my community?" "I don't have to," I said. "You're doing that yourself," someone clapped. Another followed. Then the room erupted. Karen slammed her gavel, but the noise drowned her out. "Meeting adjourned," she shouted, voice cracking. "This is not finished." She grabbed her papers and stormed out, shoving past neighbors who no longer smiled when they saw her. Afterward, Tracy pulled me aside. "That was brutal," she whispered. "She's going to explode." "She already has," I said. "Now I just need to make sure the fallout lands where it should." "Meaning?" I tapped the folder. "Audit report. I've got enough here to file a formal complaint with the city's Community Oversight Office. If I hand this over, they'll open an investigation into HOA mismanagement." Tracy hesitated. "You're sure you want to go that far?" "She tried to evict me from my own property," I said. "I'm just giving her what she earned." She nodded slowly. "Then I'll back you up." That night, I emailed the documents to my lawyer. Subject line, evidence package, HOA fraud. Ben replied 10 minutes later. "Perfect. Once they confirm she's finished, don't engage with her anymore. Just keep records." I followed his advice. No emails, no calls, no confrontations. But Karen wasn't one to fade quietly. 2 days later, I woke up to find my driveway blocked by a black SUV. My mail had been scattered across the street, and my trash bins were knocked over. There was no note, but I didn't need one. It was her. A message, petty and obvious. I called the sheriff's office and filed a report. They logged it as suspected harassment. Later that afternoon, Tracy stopped by, pale and nervous. "She's losing it," she said. "Karen called an emergency board session this morning and tried to suspend you from HOA membership. She even accused you of stalking her." "Let her," I said. "Every lie she tells is another nail in her own coffin." Tracy shook her head in disbelief. "You're calmer than I'd be," I smiled faintly. "That's the thing about bullies, Tracy. They don't know how to fight people who don't flinch." By the end of the week, the investigation was underway. The city's oversight department requested full financial statements from the HOA, and Karen's name was suddenly missing from community emails. Rumor had it the board had voted to place her on administrative leave pending review. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was quiet. No threats, no warnings, no fake violations. But as I sat on my porch that Friday night, watching the streetlights flicker across empty lawns, I knew this wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to surrender. She'd claw her way back any way she could. And when she did, I'd be ready. Not as the homeowner she thought she could bully, but as the landlord who could legally evict her from her own life. It's strange how quickly power fades when people stop believing in it. For months, Karen's word had been law around Cedar Ridge. People jumped at her emails, feared her clipboards, avoided her driveway like it was a black hole. But within days of the audit notice, the tone of the entire neighborhood shifted. The silence in our group chats was deafening. No one liked Karen anymore. They just tolerated her because she could make their lives miserable. Now that her authority was cracking, even her allies were backing away. And me? I was just watching. Every empire collapses the same way, not from outside attack, but from within. A week after the investigation started, Karen finally broke her silence. She showed up at my property unannounced, again. No clipboard this time, no papers, just fury. She parked crooked across my curb, stormed up the walkway, and started pounding on my door. "Robert," she shouted, "open up! You think you can slander me and get away with it?" I opened the door just enough to meet her eyes. She looked unhinged, hair unkempt, makeup smeared, the perfect mask of control finally slipping. "Karen," I said evenly, "you're trespassing. Don't you dare lecture me about the law," she snapped. "I built this neighborhood." I smiled faintly. "No, Karen, you bullied it into silence. And now the silence is over." Her jaw clenched. "I will ruin you. I will take your house, your business, everything you own." "You might want to be careful with those threats," I interrupted, pulling out my phone and recording. "You're still under investigation, remember?" She froze when she saw the camera lens pointed at her. For a second, her rage flickered into fear. Then she turned and stomped back to her car, slamming the door hard enough to rattle my windows. Her tires screeched as she peeled out, leaving black streaks across the asphalt. Later that evening, my lawyer Ben called. "She showed up, didn't she?" he asked. "How'd you know?" "Because the city investigator called me an hour ago. Karen's filed a harassment complaint against you," I laughed. "Of course she did." "Don't worry," Ben said. "They're not taking it seriously, but she's panicking. People always double down right before they fall apart." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the photo of Karen's signature on one of the fraudulent invoices. "Then she's close." "Oh, she's closer than you think," he said. "The Oversight Committee found inconsistencies in 5 years of HOA budgets. They've frozen the association's accounts pending review." That got my attention. "Meaning?" "Meaning," he said with a grin I could hear through the phone. "Karen's not just suspended. She's under formal investigation for embezzlement." I let out a slow breath. Finally. But as satisfying as that was, I knew she wouldn't go quietly. She was too proud to fade into the background, too consumed by the idea that the neighborhood needed her control, and I still had one. More card to play. I logged into my property management portal and opened her rental profile. Her next payment was due in 6 days. Normally, I'd have ignored it, but this time, I decided to set things in motion. I drafted a polite but firm notice. "Tenant payment reminder. Notice of non-compliance. Dear Ms. Whitmore, please be reminded that rent payment is due by the 15th. Additionally, recent actions that violate the terms of your lease, including harassment of other tenants and misuse of HOA authority, may constitute grounds for termination of tenancy. Sincerely, Hayes Realty Management." I didn't sign it personally. I didn't need to. She still had no idea who was behind the company name. When the email was sent, I sat back and smiled. The hunter was about to realize she'd been living in the trap the whole time. The next few days were calm. Eerily so. No calls. No emails, no notes taped to my door. Even the HOA mailbox stood empty, like the calm after a hurricane. But on the morning of the 15th, a new message popped up in my inbox. From Karen Whitmore. Subject: complaint regarding harassment by property management. I opened it, already knowing what to expect. "To whom it may concern, the tone and accusations in your recent correspondence are unacceptable. I demand immediate clarification of your claims, or I will be pursuing legal counsel." I laughed quietly to myself. Ben called later that afternoon. "You seem amused." "Oh, I'm beyond amused," I said. "She just threatened to sue her landlord." "She doesn't know who owns the property," he chuckled. "That's poetic." "It's poetic justice," I corrected. By Friday, the neighborhood gossip had turned into full-blown theater. Someone leaked the investigation details to the local paper. The headline hit like a thunderclap. "Cedar Ridge HOA president under investigation for financial misconduct." It spread fast. Every neighbor, every business owner nearby, even the mail carrier, everyone was talking about it. I spotted Karen that evening driving through the neighborhood, sunglasses on, head low. No clipboard, no gavel, just the look of someone watching their empire crumble. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The next morning, I was eating breakfast when there was a knock at the door. It was Tracy. She looked tired but relieved. "She's out," she said simply. I raised an eyebrow. "Officially, unanimous board vote. Effective immediately, she's removed as president. And between you and me, she's not taking it well." She sent everyone a 3-page email blaming sabotage and conspiracies. "It's unhinged," I chuckled. "Sounds like her." "There's more," Tracy added. "The Oversight Office found personal transactions made with HOA funds. They're forwarding the case to the county prosecutor." So it was happening. The end of the Karen reign. "Thanks for letting me know," I said. "Now maybe this neighborhood can finally breathe again." She smiled faintly. "You really handled this well, Robert. Most people would have lost it months ago." "I've learned something about bullies," I said. "You don't beat them by yelling louder. You beat them by letting them self-destruct." That night, I walked down to the small pond at the edge of Cedar Ridge, the same place where Karen once tried to ban unapproved gatherings. The water shimmered under the streetlights. It felt like the neighborhood itself was sighing in relief. I thought about how close she'd come to ruining everything. My peace, my home, my reputation, all because she couldn't stand the idea of not being in control. But now she was done. And the poetic part? She still didn't know the man who'd ended her HOA empire also had the power to end her lease. The timing, I thought, would be perfect. Let her stew a little longer. Let her think the HOA loss was her only punishment. Then, when the next rent cycle rolled around, she'd get one final surprise. A letter that began with the same word she'd once tried to use against me. 2 weeks. That's how long it took for the HOA investigation to turn from rumor to reality. The oversight office confirmed everything. The fake vendor invoices, the unapproved spending, even the falsified maintenance reports. Karen was officially charged with embezzlement, misuse of community funds, and fraud. The email from the county clerk came with a case number and a court date. It was finally happening. But strangely, I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt done. Done with her letters, her lies, her desperate attempts to control people who never wanted her power. Still, part of me knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. Karen had one last storm in her. That storm hit on a Wednesday morning. I was in my home office going through paperwork when I heard someone pounding on the front door. Not knocking, pounding. I opened it to find Karen standing there, red-faced, eyes wild, clutching a stack of papers. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You think this is over?" I stayed calm. "Karen, you're not supposed to be here. You're under a restraining order from the HOA. I don't care about their order," she shouted, waving the papers. "You ruined me. My reputation, my job, everything. You've been behind this from the start." I kept my voice level. "Karen, you did that to yourself," she glared at me, trembling. "You'll regret this. You and that sleazy lawyer of yours." I stepped closer, lowering my tone. "You really don't want to do this right now. You're trespassing, and you're being recorded." She froze when I pointed to the security camera on my porch. Her expression shifted, fury to panic to something like defeat. Then she dropped the papers and walked away. I watched her car disappear down the street, her brake lights flashing like the last sparks of a dying fire. Ben called later that day. "So she paid you a visit?" "Yeah," I said. "She's unraveling," he sighed. "Let her. The prosecutor's office is moving forward with the fraud charges, but there's something else. She's missed her last rent payment." I paused. "You're sure?" "Positive. It's past due by a week. Your property management team sent 2 notices already." I leaned back in my chair, the corner of my mouth lifting. "Then it's time," he chuckled. "You really are going to do it, huh?" "She tried to evict me from my own home, Ben. I think it's poetic she gets served with one of her own." The next day, I drafted the notice myself. It felt almost surreal typing the words. "Notice to vacate, lease termination for cause. Dear Ms. Whitmore, due to violation of lease terms, non-payment of rent, and conduct creating disturbance and harassment of others, your tenancy is hereby terminated effective immediately. You have 10 days to vacate the premises or further legal action will be pursued. Sincerely, Hayes Realty Management." I printed it, signed it, and handed it to one of my team members to deliver in person. It was official. 2 days later, I got a call. "Robert," said the voice on the other end, my property manager, Lisa. "We served the notice." She lost it. Define lost it. She started yelling about how she's the HOA president, that she knows the landlord personally, and that this is illegal. I didn't say anything, but she's threatening to call the city. I smiled. "Let her call. They'll love to hear from her again." Lisa laughed nervously. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" "I wouldn't say enjoying," I said, sipping my coffee. "Let's call it closure." By the weekend, the story had gone public. The local paper ran an update. "Former HOA president faces eviction amid fraud charges." It was the kind of headline that felt like the universe itself. Balancing the scales, neighbors started stopping by to talk. People who had once avoided me for fear of crossing Karen. They brought casseroles, cookies, even offers to help with repairs she'd ordered unjustly. One of them, an elderly man named Mr. Benton, clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You finally did what we all wanted to do for years." "You took down the HOA tyrant," I smiled. "I just followed the rules." Turns out she didn't, he laughed. You've got a funny way of serving justice. Comes with the job, I said. The following Monday, Karen finally learned who her landlord was. I was in my office when I got the email notification. Tenant response, urgent. I opened it and there it was. A short, frantic message from Karen. This must be a mistake. I just found out the owner of my rental property is Robert Hayes. There's a conflict of interest here. You can't evict me. This is unethical and retaliatory. I couldn't help but laugh. The irony was too perfect. Ben called 15 minutes later, laughing too. She just filed an injunction to stop the eviction. And get this, she claimed you targeted her because she's your HOA president. She still thinks she's the president? Apparently. The court's not buying it. The injunction was denied within an hour. The judge even noted her pattern of harassment. I leaned back, grinning. Then it's official. The woman who tried to evict me from my own home is about to lose hers. That night, I went for a walk through the neighborhood. The air felt lighter somehow, like the weight of months of tension had finally lifted. People were outside again. Kids were playing on bikes, and for the first time since Karen took over, Cedar Ridge actually looked like a neighborhood instead of a battlefield. As I passed her house, or rather, my house that she rented, I saw the lights on inside. Curtains drawn. Her car parked at an angle like always. For a second, I almost felt pity. Almost. But then I remembered every threat, every letter, every false accusation she'd thrown my way. She'd wanted power. She'd abused it. And now she was paying the price. Not because I fought dirty, but because I fought smart. 2 days later, the sheriff's department confirmed the eviction order had been processed. Karen had 10 days to leave. She filed one last desperate appeal, but it was dismissed instantly. On the morning she was supposed to move out, I drove past just to see for myself. Boxes were stacked on her porch. Movers were loading furniture into a rented truck. She stood by the door, arms crossed, glaring at everything around her as if the whole world had betrayed her. When she noticed my car, our eyes met for a brief moment. No words, no shouting. Just the raw, heavy realization that the game was over, and I'd won without ever raising my voice. She turned away first. That evening, I poured myself a drink and sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the rooftops. It wasn't revenge that I tasted in that moment. It was peace. The kind that comes when justice doesn't need to be shouted, just served. Karen had played her hand, and for the first time, she'd met someone who didn't fold. And as I watched the quiet street stretch out before me, I realized the truth that made the whole thing poetic. The woman who once tried to control my life had been living under my roof the entire time. And when she tried to take my home, I simply reminded her who owned hers. The morning after Karen moved out was the quietest day Cedar Ridge had seen in years. No early emails about violations. No HOA patrols circling the block. No passive-aggressive notes tucked into mailboxes. The air just breathed again. It's strange how peace doesn't feel like victory. It feels like the absence of noise. Like the neighborhood itself had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I stepped out onto my porch with a cup of coffee and just listened. Birds, a lawnmower in the distance, the sound of kids laughing down the street, ordinary things. Things that had been missing for far too long. Over the next few days, people started stopping by to talk. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to before, all with the same look of relief. Feels like a new place, doesn't it? Said Mr. Benton, tipping his hat as he passed. Like we finally got our neighborhood back, added Tracy, who walked up carrying a box of files from the old HOA office. She set them on my porch and sighed. You should have seen the mess she left behind. Unauthorized fines, missing receipts, even fake maintenance requests. It's going to take months to clean up. I glanced at the box and smiled. Good thing we've got time now. Tracy hesitated. Robert, I know this whole thing got personal, but you handled it better than anyone could have. Most people would have fought her head on. You just let the truth bury her. I shrugged. People like Karen don't need enemies. They self-destruct on their own schedule. I just made sure the paperwork was waiting when it happened." Tracy laughed softly. "Well, the board voted last night. We want you to join us." I nearly spit out my coffee. "You're joking?" "Not at all," she said. "We need someone who actually understands property law and isn't driven by ego." I chuckled. "I'll think about it. But if I join, the first rule is simple. No clipboards." She grinned. "Deal." As the weeks passed, the neighborhood started to transform. The new HOA meetings were open and friendly. No shouting, no intimidation, just real conversations. Instead of writing people up for their porch lights or mailbox designs, we focused on what actually mattered: safety, maintenance, community. We created a fund to help elderly residents with home repairs and started a community garden in the empty lot Karen once called an eyesore. For the first time, Cedar Ridge actually felt like a neighborhood, not a kingdom ruled by fear. I'd walk by at sunset and see families barbecuing in their driveways, teenagers tossing basketballs in the street, and no one worrying about getting fined for it. And every time I saw those moments, I'd think, this is what freedom looks like. As for Karen, the last I heard, she'd moved into a small apartment 2 counties over. The fraud case was still pending, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd lost her title, her reputation, and her precious HOA. Kingdom. Part of me wondered how she justified it all in her head. If she still believed she'd been wronged, or if she finally realized that control had been her downfall. Didn't hate her anymore. In a way, I pitied her. She was a woman who needed to be the center of every circle. And when the circle disappeared, she didn't know who she was anymore. Still, pity doesn't erase damage, and she caused plenty of it. But karma, as they say, has a long memory. One afternoon, a letter arrived in my mailbox with the county seal. It was the final notice from the court. The People versus Karen Whitmore, guilty plea accepted. Sentenced to probation, restitution, and community service. I stared at the page for a while, feeling a quiet satisfaction. She wouldn't go to prison, but she'd pay back every dollar she stole. Not in isolation, but by cleaning up parks, repainting walls, and repairing the kind of community she'd once tried to control. That, I thought, was poetic justice. Later that week, the board held a small gathering at the clubhouse to celebrate a fresh start. No speeches, no drama, just neighbors coming together. Tracy handed me a drink and said, "You know, I think we should rename the HOA newsletter." "Oh?" I asked. "What to?" She smiled. "How about the Cedar Ridge rebuild?" "Seems fitting." I raised my glass. "I'll drink to that." Across the room, laughter filled the air, genuine, not forced. It felt like the first real laughter this neighborhood had heard in years. When I finally got home that night, I sat on my porch again, same spot where this whole thing started. The sky was painted in soft orange and gold, and the quiet hum of crickets filled the air. I thought about everything that had happened. The fake eviction, the cops at my door, the courtroom drama, the eviction notice I'd served in return. It all felt like something from another life, and yet every piece of it had led here, to this peace, this balance, this stillness. Funny how justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just whispers, "You're free now." A few days later, I drove past the property Karen had once rented from me. It had been cleaned out, freshly painted, and a new tenant was moving in. A young couple with a golden retriever and an energy that reminded me what new beginnings looked like. They waved when they saw me. I waved back. No drama, no tension, just neighbors, and for the first time I felt like Cedar Ridge truly belonged to everyone again. As the months passed, life found its rhythm. The HOA thrived under new leadership. Ben still joked that I should have gone into politics, and every time someone brought up the old days, we all just smiled and said, "Not anymore." But sometimes late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside was still, I'd glance at the file box in my office, the one labeled HOA Case 2024. Inside were copies of every letter, every email, every receipt. I could have thrown it all away by now, but I didn't. Not out of spite, but as a reminder that power without accountability becomes poison. That peace doesn't come from control, it comes from fairness. And that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well under your own roof. Before turning in that night, I stepped out onto the porch one last time. The air was cool, the moonlight soft against the rooftops, and the neighborhood utterly still. No more shouting, no more fear, just home, the same home Karen once tried to take from me, the same one that stood through every storm. I smiled to myself and whispered, "Guess who's still here? Karen." Then I closed the door, turned off the light, and let peace have the last word.